Okay, our speaker for the final talk today is Ronald, currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Australian National University. He graduated from Rutgers a year ago, is that right? And next year will begin a position as an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky. Ron has worked on the notion of information and related issues in the context of molecular biology and genetics, but is also interested in the role of information and related concepts in cognition, and that's going to be the subject of today's talk. So, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you for the invitation. I've really been enjoying myself so far, so hopefully I'll continue the trend of interesting talks here. So yeah, the topic today is evolving a language of thought. So in the most general sense of the thesis, the language of thought hypothesis maintains that thought and thinking are carried out in an internal language. And what motivates the kind of description of this internal science system as language, a language or language-like, is the possession of a compositional syntax and semantics. So to a good approximation, I'll actually be cashing out these notions in a slightly unusual way later in the talk. But the idea is that the sign system contains complex signs that are built up out of other signs that belong to the system. And it has compositional semantics in the sense that the meaning of each complex sign is determined by the meaning of its constituent parts together with their mode of composition. Okay, and the kind of okay, yeah, that's actually perfect. Thank you. And the final, idea here is that in addition to these signs, there are a set of computational procedures that are sensitive only to the formal properties of signs. And it's in virtue of these procedures that the signs are transformed and manipulated in various ways. And that's critical to the kind of thinking dimension of the language of thought hypothesis. So just in terms of very, very quick overview for the motivation for the, I'll just say Loth frequently. So I think, and this was Fodor's original line of argument, and it's still quite convincing to me and many others, that something like Loth is presupposed by mainstream cognitive science, past and present. It seems to be foundational to some of our very best theories in cognitive science. You might have to do a little bit of digging to uncover that fact. It's not always, on the surface, but I do think that it's there. And in terms of more philosophical motivations, it explains the physical possibility of reasoning, and the way that it does that is essentially by combining or marrying insights from symbolic logic and computer science. From symbolic logic, we know how to design a formal system where transitions among syntactically defined entities mirror semantic relations between those entities. And from computer science, we know how a physical system like the brain could instantiate a formal system. Once we've sort of explained that, we've explained how we can have a kind of sequence of physical states that don't just sort of follow one another in a haphazard fashion, but bear some kind of semantic relation to one another, whether it's logical entailment or justification or something like this. So in terms of the other motivations here, the productivity of thought and thinking, this is just the idea that there's no upper bound to the number of thoughts or thought processes we're capable of entertaining. This basically falls out of Loth, and it's contentious whether it falls out of any other sort of architecture. But suffice it to say that it's certainly something you get on a language of thought architecture. And also the systematicity of thought and thinking, where the idea here is if you're capable of thinking certain thoughts, you're capable of thinking other kind of systematically related thoughts. And same for thinking. If you're capable of, say, carrying out certain sums, oftentimes we find minds, maybe always, we don't even need to say always, but if you're capable of certain thought processes, you'll be capable of other thought processes. So there's a kind of clustering of both thought abilities and actual thought processes. So these are just some of the kind of motivations that have been offered for the language of thought hypothesis through the years. Now, so despite the centrality of this thesis or hypothesis to mainstream cognitive science and much philosophy of mind, no attention has been paid to the question of how a language of thought might evolve in the first place. So as I see it, what we really need in this area is what's known as a lineage explanation. And that is a series of small incremental steps that suffice to take us from a baseline where the capacity or trait in question is clearly absent to one at which it's clearly present. And importantly, each step in that series confers some adaptive benefit on its bearer relative to the preceding stage. So the aim of this talk isn't going to be to offer a kind of fully fleshed out, empirically supported lineage explanation for a language of thought, but to just provide some key concepts and processes that I think will figure into such explanations, hopefully as our understanding of the brain at various levels matures. And to this end, I'm going to be drawing upon recent work from the evolution of communication literature, stuff that's been going on the last few years, stuff that I've contributed to and others in this room have contributed to. So this is the kind of novel approach to the question. And I think that's exactly what we need, is a kind of fresh perspective on this kind of key issue here. So just a bit about why this problem is hard. There are some analogies with the evolution of language proper here. And in particular, it's unclear what plausible intermediate stages would be. So what is it like to have a kind of rudimentary form of compositional syntax and semantics, and what kind of adaptive benefit would accrue to a system in virtue of having those sorts of properties? So that's kind of mysterious on its face. Certainly the way it's normally set up, it just looks like this is a kind of full functioning science system of the sort that you might find in a computer. Well, that of course is the product of intentional design on our part, foresight, all sorts of things. How does this arise via blind kind of evolutionary processes and do so in small incremental steps? And the other issue here, another analogy with language, is that both in the case of a language of thought and language proper, it's a tool for coordinating the behavior of two devices or mechanisms or individuals, what we might call a sender and receiver. And so this kind of sets up a problem because it becomes mysterious how a change on one side can confer any benefit without a simultaneous and complementary change on the other side occurring, which, all other things being equal, seems like a low probability event. So these kinds of behaviors on the part of sender and receiver are response-dependent adaptations. And insofar as that's the case, it can sometimes be mysterious how you get these features in the system. If the sender starts doing something clever but the receiver's not paying attention or not exploiting it, what's going to kind of retain that feature in the system? Things of this sort. So to tackle these problems, I'm going to be using the kind of sender-receiver perspective or framework, which has become increasingly influential in recent years. So here's the plan. I'm going to introduce that framework very, very briefly. Then I'm going to move on to some possible features of sign systems and how they can arise. So I'll discuss combinatorial sign systems, encoding sign systems, and then compositional syntax and semantics. Then I'll look at how these concepts and processes I developed might be applied in the case of a language of thought. And there I'm really just going to give a proof of concept rather than a kind of, as I said, empirically detailed account. And then I'll just summarize the conclusions. But before doing that, real quick, just some points about what a language of thought hypothesis isn't committed to. So, for example, I would argue that it's compatible with the falsity of folk psychology. What folk psychology is, of course, is open to debate. People have different ideas. But it's not sort of hostage to, psychology vindicating the folk way of thinking. The language of thought hypothesis is often presented that way, and it's seen as one of its primary virtues, that it's poised to vindicate this way of thinking about the mind. But I see it as, sort of having independent worth, and its independent worth is in explaining things like systematicity, productivity, reason respecting transitions, so on and so forth. That could all obtain, and folk psychology could be massively in error. It's also fully compatible with the existence of non-language of thought-based thought and cognition. So I mean, some aspects of cognition might be better explained by non-language-like vehicles. All it says is that there are some processes that sort of fit this mold of the language of thought mold. It's, of course, compatible with multiple languages of thought, even within the same individual's brain, right? So there needn't be this sole language of thought shared by all intelligent creatures or anything of that sort. And somewhat more controversially, I would say it's compatible with a somewhat deflationary attitude or orientation towards philosophical semantics. So I think you needn't sort of claim that there's one true kind of theory of mental representation, or that mental representations always have determinate content or anything like that. The important bit, as far as I can tell, is that whatever kind of story you want to tell about the kind of meaning of mental states, it's going to be a compositional story so that you can build up complex, meaningful wholes out of meaningful parts. Okay, so here's the framework in a nutshell. You have a variable state of the world. States occur in accordance with some probability distribution. You have a sender individual, can see the state of the world, but can't act on it. All she can do is produce some sign. You have a receiver that can't see the state of the world, but can observe the state of the sign and perform an act. Okay? Both sender and receiver have preferences over state-act pairs, and it's in virtue of, how acts are performed in various states that senders and receivers get certain payoffs. And the kind of net effect of this is that the rules which sender implements mapping states of the world to signs, and the rule by which receiver maps signs to acts co-evolve in various ways. So really the kind of important bits for us, now that's like an extreme, quick description, but the important bits for us is that the information that signs carry about states of the world is determined by the sender's rule, the way that the sender maps states of the world to signs. But that rule is itself dependent upon what's waiting downstream, the receiver's rule, but that's over time. So really the kind of core message for our purposes is that communication on this view is at its heart a process of coevolution or co-adaptation. It's the kind of coevolution of rules for producing signs and for interpreting signs. Now, on to the features of sign systems. So I'm going to set things up in a slightly unusual way, but I think this is necessary to make progress on the question at issue. So as far as, this is how I'm going to understand combinatorial signs. There are lots of, people in linguistics that would set things up a bit differently, but this is what I'm working with at the moment. So I want to say a sign system is combinatorial. Sign system is just some set of signs that's utilized by a sender-receiver system. So a sign system is combinatorial when signs in that system share constituents or physical parts. So another way of putting that is that the signs are structured by some shares a constituent relation. So if you look at this sign system, it's combinatorial because they're sharing of parts among signs. Okay? Pretty straightforward. If you were to actually look at a relation like shares a part, it would collect various pairs of these signs. That needn't be the case, right? So I think that this is what people have in mind when they talk about, say, bird song being combinatorial, for example. Now, how can this arise? Well, I think that there are probably a number of ways, but I'm just going to highlight two here. So one is a process of fusion, what I'll call fusion, of sender-receiver systems. So the idea is simple. You have two independently, two previously independent sender-receiver systems becoming entangled. How does that work? Well, you can imagine a receiver B sometimes interacts with sender A, and receiver B sometimes acts with sender C. And what winds up happening is B starts conditioning his response to B on the signals that he has previously received from A. And in this way, the kind of sender rule of sender A and sender B become enmeshed with one another and sort of brought into this coevolutionary feedback loop. So in this way, you can just start to recruit more signs, and in so doing, you gain new information, and I mean, this is a kind of quite a straightforward process. Another sort of temporal analog here would be what I call temporal broadening of a sender-receiver system. So you imagine A and B locked into a sender-receiver system. B starts to wait before he acts. So now he waits to see a sequence of signs and then performs some action. And in this way, the receiver rule has become sensitive to sequences of signs being sent by the sender. And this gives the sender some kind of evolutionary incentive, possibly, to now change its sender rule in various ways. And again, here, you can gain access to new states of the world in this way. States that you can only acquire information about by looking at sequences of signs as opposed to individual signs. So that's two ways in which this sort of feature can arise. And we can say, in terms of the benefit it confers, a combinatorial sign system gives access to a larger range of world states. So you could just imagine in the case of fusion, for example, B now gains access not only to the signs that are sort of the information independently carried by A's signs or independently carried by C's signs, but by combinations of the signs that B gets from A and C. And it's quite easy to spell out how you can gain access to new parts of one's environment in this way. And in the ideal case, this is sort of looking at it in a more top-down way, but in the ideal case, the demand on physical resources for realizing signs will grow logarithmically with the number of discriminated world states. So if you need to discriminate 2 signs, yeah?
Just a clarification. Are you talking about parts of the nervous system, these senders and receivers, or different organisms?
I haven't gotten to that yet. It's supposed to be neutral on that so far, yeah. But in the ideal case, you need to discriminate 2 world states, you need 2 signs, you need 1 binary kind of variable for that. For 4, you need 2 binary variables. For 8, 3, so on and so forth. As the number of states you need to discriminate goes up, this becomes critically important for obvious reasons. Okay, so that's how I understand combinatorial signs. Now I want to introduce another notion, encoding sign systems. So I'll say a sign system is encoding when the meaning of signs in that system is given by an encoding principle. Now, what I mean by this, it's a principle, so it's a feature of this principle that it must represent both the world state and the sign that's to be sent in that state using 1 or more variables. It has to in virtue of its general nature. So let me illustrate this with an example. Imagine a sign system in which food patch quality is indicated to, say, conspecifics in accordance with the rule E times 50 hertz, where E is the number of energy units that the sender has acquired at that patch. So here's a kind of way of spelling out that encoding principle here. So any sign in the system gets its kind of form in virtue of this equation here, as it were. How can this sort of thing arise? It seems like the very kind of thing that you need to set up in advance with intelligent foresight, that sort of thing. Well, that needn't be the case. So we can distinguish at a minimum 2 pathways. So a sender-first pathway where there's a pattern in the sign production behavior which comes first, or a receiver-first pathway, a pattern in sign interpretation behavior comes first. So I should just say at this point, some of this work overlaps and is inspired by some recent stuff by Peter Godfrey Smith and stuff that him and I are working on together. So there's a lot of stuff that's kind of a joint sort of effort in this bit right here, although he shouldn't be taken to sign on to everything I'm saying. And this notion of an encoding sign system is mine. So I don't know that he would like that, the notion here. But at any rate, the kind of one benefit that's conferred, again, I don't think there's a simple answer to the question, but a single answer, but one benefit is that an encoding sign system allows for coordination in novel situations. So just think about it this way. Well, actually, it'll be clear with the example I give. So let's imagine a concrete example of this. So we can imagine a sender that's disposed to produce higher frequency signs for higher quality patches. This is the kind of first step, right, of a sender-first pathway. This could easily be the result of some kind of physiological constraint. There's greater physiological arousal after having found a higher quality food source, something of this sort. Okay? This need not be a systematic pattern initially, and where by that I mean there needn't be any general way to express the difference in frequency between any two signs indicating patch quality, as there is when we've gotten to a full encoding sign system where everything kind of goes in accordance with that single principle. But as I've set the story up, it's true that there's a correspondence between a relation among signs, say, has a higher frequency than, and a relation among world states has a higher quality than. And this alone might select for a disposition in receivers to do something complementary, like adopt search plans of longer duration, the higher the frequency of the observed sign. And now we have the beginnings of a kind of coevolutionary feedback loop. The senders come to produce signs in a more systematic way. Receivers come to interpret signs in a more systematic way, and so on. And at a minimum, what we have is kind of increased coordination in novel situations all along the way, and probably other benefits as well, simplifying the computational mechanisms involved. Okay, so on to the compositional syntax and semantics issue here. Here's my proposal. And so hopefully this is already going some way towards demystifying how a language of thought might evolve. So as I see it, compositional syntax and semantics represents a marriage of the foregoing features. It's a combinatorial sign system associated with an encoding principle or several such principles, which makes reference to the constituents of signs. So in slogan form, you can think, physical constituents of signs play a semantic role in the system. So I'll illustrate this with a easier example before we talk about the language of thought. If you know how binary works already, just bear with me. I'll be quick. But just imagine this sign system, and suppose it's encoded in binary. I'll give you a better explanation in the next slide. But this sign system is clearly combinatorial in my sense. It's structured by a number of shares of constituent relations. For example, shares the rightmost constituent will collect certain pairs of signs, and there are other shares of constituent relations here. And it's encoding in my sense, and where by that I just mean the sign meaning. Each sign in the system has its meaning determined by this principle here. Now, we need to sort of go through the kind of mathematical details, but you get the idea. You can look at it like this, right? The rightmost bit, a 0 there means you get 0 factors of this. A 1 there means you got 1 factor of that. Here, 0 means 0 factors of this. 1 means 1 factor of that, so on and so forth. And concatenation stands in for addition here. So any sign in the system has its meaning determined in accordance with this general rule. Now, a compositional syntax and semantics has enormous importance for computational power. And why? Well, because it allows for compact signs and compact procedures. So this is a term that comes from Randy Gallistel, although I'm making slightly different usage of the concept here. But the way I would put it is this. With a combinatorial sign system, you get compact signs in the sense that the number of signs you can realize grows much faster than the demand on sign stuff. It needn't be logarithmically, right? Or exponentially here. But it grows faster, and that's in virtue of building complex signs out of, a stock of atomic signs. And the encoding nature of the sign system, what's this do? It allows for compact procedures. So by that I mean a procedure, the storage of which makes less of a demand on memory stuff than a lookup table for the function. So the first point, I take it, is rather obvious. I'm just going to focus on the second point here. So let's go through an example. Imagine computing addition on signs indicating the number of nearby food patches. So you just get signs that tell you how many food patches there are in the region, and you have to compute addition on these. So maybe a sender goes off, in front of the nest, another sender goes off behind the nest, They come back, you get the two signs, and you have to determine the total number of food patches in this environment or something like that, right? Now, if the signs are encoded in binary, the receiver can avail himself of a compact procedure. So, you know, to a good approximation here, the idea would just be you have some kind of procedure which functions as follows. You arrange one sign above the other, and you go to the rightmost column, write a 0 under that column if it contains 2 zeros, a 1, blah, blah, blah. We don't need to go through it. The idea is that there's this kind of recipe for computing the sum in this case, right? Now, you know, it's quite obvious that this would not take much by way of physical resources to realize this procedure. It's rather trivial to realize, in fact. And more importantly, I think, the demand on memory stuff here, on physical resources, remains fixed no matter how large the set of possible signs becomes. So you only need this one recipe, and you know, the set of signs can grow as large as you like, and the set of possible sums that you have to compute can grow as large as you like. So there's a fixed demand on physical resources for the algorithm or procedure, independently of the size of the set of sums you have to compute. Now, here's the critical point. If instead the signs are non-encoding, in my sense of the term, the best the receiver can do is implement a lookup table specifying the value for every possible sum. So, you know, roughly speaking, the idea would be this lookup table would have to specify all the ordered pairs of world states. You know, this is a world state, this is a world state, and this is another world state. So the idea is that this world state corresponds to the kind of sum of these world states, which are in the relation is the sum of. And here f is supposed to be a function that's mapping each sign to the world state it indicates. So this is the best you can do if there's no kind of pattern that you can exploit in your sign system. So there's this kind of intimate connection between the way you represent data and the set of algorithms that you can use for computing various relations and functions. I mean, this is a key insight of computer science. So to summarize that bit, encoding signs allow for the extraction of information about relations among world states on a need-to basis, when and only should they become salient for the animal. In contrast, if the signs are non-encoding, the animal must represent in advance every pair that is in the relation in question, and this is, you know, a very sort of, this is a crippling constraint. Why? Well, as the number, imagine, just go back to this case. So a sign system with 10 possible signs will already require a lookup table in the thousands to kind of just get you the possible sums you need. If you have 20 signs, you're already in the millions. So you need, you know, a lookup table with 1 million entries to kind of just be prepared to compute the sum of these signs. That's just for one relation the animal might want to track. You know, so as the signs go up, an individual lookup table becomes physically impossible to realize, much less, you know, realizing lookup tables for multiple relations that the animal might want to be tracking. Addition, averages, you know, multiplication, things of this sort, and lots of other features. Right, so as the number of relations the animal must keep track of increases, this kind of arrangement using lookup tables, which is the best you can do if you have a non-encoding sign system, becomes physically impossible. How am I doing for time?
You have about 15 more minutes.
Okay, great. Okay, so what does that have to do with the language of thought? You know, I'm talking about numbers and various things. Well, signs or sentences in a language of thought, if you prefer, are conceived of as being built out of concepts and logical operators. You know, the relationship between something like a numerically, a sign system that encodes numbers and a sign system that might be visible at a higher level. Of course, you know, if you can encode numbers, you can encode anything, so the relationship might be more complicated, but set that aside. I just want to say, no matter here, the same considerations apply in the case of a language of thought. It is because the sign system has a compositional syntax and semantics, that is, because it's combinatorial and encoding, that an essentially infinite number of meaningful signs and computational processes on them can be realized with finite physical resources. All right, so this is the last chunk of the talk now. So we're going to apply these kinds of ideas to a language of thought. So we've transformed the question before us into this. how might an internal sign system, which is both combinatorial and encoding in the way that I specified earlier, encoding in the sense that it gives some kind of role in the system to the parts of the signs, how might that evolve together with various procedures for operating on these signs? Okay, so let's go back to the sender-receiver framework. Well, here's one sense in which that framework is general. It applies to communication both within and between organisms, okay? So this is nicely set out by Peter Godfrey Smith in a somewhat recent paper. You know, I have a paper looking at how to apply this sort of stuff within the individual cell and with genes. And so, you know, I mean, this is quite clear. But the important message for our purposes is that, you know, within organism cases of communication are, setting aside some very special cases, maximally conducive to the evolution of sophisticated sign systems, as they typically involve an absence of conflict between senders and receivers due to something like shared reproductive fate. And so from this perspective, it's not at all surprising that many of the most sophisticated sign systems which are evolved are within the organism one. So the genetic code being a beautiful case of this. Or the many codes that are deployed in the course of development to transmit positional information and things of this sort. And you know, depending on whether you think, say, a bee colony is an organism, which some people would say, you know, you might think it's no surprise that you get kind of sophisticated sign systems in eusocial insects. That's exactly what this kind of orientation and communication would lead us to expect. Okay, and so here's another sense in which the framework's general. It applies to communication both across spatial and temporal gaps. And this, again, is something that Godfrey Smith has discussed nicely in detail. But the idea is that when it's a temporal gap that's being bridged, okay, when there's communication over a temporal gap, we have a memory system. Okay, so in such a sign system, signs often need to endure for indefinite periods of time. This is just a kind of basic fact about most memory systems. You don't know how long you'll need some bit of information for, so you have to design the system so things can sort of last indefinitely long. And so I think that there are various reasons why this sort of often gives rise to a system of this sort, where there's a setup where senders just write down informational locations where that information can be later accessed by receivers. Basically, this allows signs to be specialized to endurance as opposed to having to endure and transverse physical space. Those two kinds of job requirements are often at odds with one another. So a single receiver at a time may enjoy access to a large body of signs produced by different senders over time. How does that happen? Well, the receiver just needs to sort of go from location to location and look up the sign that's written there. So, you know, here you get the sign from yesterday, here you get the sign from 2 days ago, so on and so forth. The receiver just needs to know where to look. That information is sort of all sprawled out in front of it, as it were. And that's a kind of unique feature about the temporal gap. Okay, so in the case of a language of thought, we're looking at the evolution of a within the organism sign system, and that means we can assume maximal conduciveness to the evolution of fancy sign systems. And presumably both spatial and temporal gaps are relevant here. So this raises a number of interesting questions. For example, might the same language of thought be used for real-time cognition and for memory? If so, did this language of thought or set of languages of thought evolve first for one function, then later become co-opted for the other function? Or if not, and this is what I would tentatively incline towards, are there different languages of thought for these different functions? And if so, how did they interact over evolutionary time? I can't get into that stuff today. What I want to do is just take a narrow focus and look at the connection between a language of thought and memory in the last bit of time I have. And I want to sketch a highly abstract account of how a language of thought for memory might emerge. And I intend this as no more than a proof of concept. So imagine our baseline here, a simple stimulus response system. You have stimuli come in, excite sensory neurons. They excite effector neurons and prompt an act on the part of the organism. Now imagine that occasionally excitation of sensory neurons leaves a trace of some sort. Effector neurons come to partially condition output behavior on the value of these traces. So think of a trace as a variable, and it can be in one or another state. And it turns out to be adaptive. It's an adaptive arrangement for the organism for these ways of writing and reading traces to be in place. And so that kind of arrangement is retained and spreads. And here we have the emergence of a kind of primitive memory system. So how could it become combinatorial? Well, it's quite simple, right? You might have a population of effector cells becoming sensitive to 2 traces, then 3 traces, eventually giving rise to a large-scale combinatorial sign system. And benefits in this case, well, again, it's going to provide access to new world states and/or increased information about some already accessible states. But perhaps unique to memory is this. Combinatorial signs will also increase the carrying capacity of the system. How does that work? Well, if you think you have a kind of fixed set of physical resources, if you build your signs so that they're combinatorial, you get far more signs using those same resources than you would if you don't use combinatorial signs. If there's a fixed number of kind of physical resources for storing and carrying forward signs over time, you can store more with combinatorial signs than otherwise. So it ups your carrying capacity. That's a kind of unique to memory and provides another sort of advantage. What about encoding, the feature of encoding? Well, imagine a sender-first pathway. So we imagine some pattern in the way traces are written down initially. So one population of sensory cells produces a greater polarization in another population of cells, the greater the intensity of some perceived body. And we imagine a second population of sensory cells producing greater polarization in yet another population, the closer the perceived body. And we have already seen how these two can become enmeshed and fused. So we have a kind of set of complex signs here with one part indicating the color of the body, the other the distance from the self. And as in the case I presented earlier, these patterns can then undergo refinement and ultimately give rise to an encoding rule. And what are the benefits of this sort of arrangement? Well, again, there's improved coordination in novel situations. The receiver can do better than blind trial and error, so it gets a new sign. It needn't just sort of try out a random thing. It knows, even at primitive or rudimentary stages, there's some relation whereby kind of exploiting that relation in some way, you can do better than chance. And here's a possibly unique feature of the memory channel. You get improved computational power. So I'm almost through this. So let me just illustrate that last point, because that's not obvious. So imagine a receiver. Again, now we're thinking of this as a kind of mechanism within the brain that enjoys access to multiple memory traces and may compare different signs from this, the system. Actually, it needn't even be specific to the brain. That's just one possible case. So just think of a receiver who enjoys access to multiple memory traces from different signs from the system. Now, relations among signs come to take on new importance in this case. Why is that? Well, let's give an example. Imagine a memory trace that records the number of encountered food patches per day. Okay, and imagine that greater polarization goes with larger numerical numbers. So I've seen 10 patches today, that gets a certain frequency. 20 patches, yesterday, that gets a higher frequency, so on and so forth. Now, the receiver can use a compact procedure to determine whether, say, the food availability is increasing or not along its current trajectory or path. What does it have to do? It simply has to compare the polarization levels of these different populations of cells, realizing these different memory traces. Okay? Remember, that's only in virtue of there being this kind of encoding property of the sign system. Otherwise, it'd have to use a lookup table. So through coevolution, we could have the emergence of a more systematic sign production and interpretation behavior, and again, ultimately an encoding system, where here the kind of benefit being conferred is this increased computational power. And so this allows a larger range of relations to then be computed using compact procedures. So as this system evolves towards a kind of bona fide encoding sign system where there's a general principle that specifies the meaning of all the signs in the system, you get this highly organized kind of sign system, which then allows for addition, averages, all sorts of computations that you might want to compute. And so this, in essence, means a larger range of thought processes become available to the animal. So in the case of memory, it's likely for multiple evolutionary forces to push a sign system in the direction of compositional syntax and semantics. What pushes it in the combinatorial direction? This expands the set of world states that can be written to memory at a time, and also the number of signs that can be carried forward over time. And the encoding nature of the system improves coordination in novel situations, and that's coordination between stuff in the organism and greater computational power as well. And so together with the absence of conflicting interests, I would argue that this makes the emergence of a language of thought quite plausible in the case of memory in particular. All right, so to just summarize, the language of thought hypothesis is a foundational assumption of mainstream cognitive science, both past and present, and also it's poised, perhaps uniquely so, to solve some of the very hardest puzzles about the nature of the mind. For example, the very possibility of reasoning in a physical world. It's worrisome that no serious attention has been paid to how a language of thought might evolve. In some sense, it very much remains an unexplained explainer. So what I've tried to do here is take some steps towards correcting this situation. I've tried to provide a number of key concepts and processes that will figure into evolutionary explanations for sign systems with compositional syntax and semantics, and also for procedures that operate on those signs, and sketched how these tools might be specifically used in the case of a language of thought. So I'd say at the very least, there need be nothing mysterious about the language of thought hypothesis on evolutionary grounds. Okay, that's it. Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
So thank you. I have like a clarificatory question and then a more kind of substantive thing, I think. So the clarificatory thing. So when you appeal to I'm trying to understand the encoding concept. So is the idea that there's encoding when so in the terms of the sender-receiver model, the idea is that when there's encoding when there's a complex sender strategy in which new signs can be produced without combining previous signs. So is that the idea?
Well, the way that I set it up here, yeah, it's supposed to be that there can be an encoding. Sign system can be encoding without there having to be syntax at all. Right? Yeah.
But so encoding basically is a complex sender's rule. Once you have a complex sender rule, I mean that's the way of understanding the thing, right? Yeah. Yep. So I don't know whether these Cmax Games, like Kaylin O'Connor has worked on this kind of instead of having set of states, set of messages, and a set of actions, you have a space of different points, and then you have a set of I don't know. Do you know it or?
I'm not familiar with this
okay.
work, but I am familiar with her work more generally.
Okay, so she has worked on this kind of thing.
Yeah.
But just the more thing, so the more substantive thing, I think.
Yeah.
So what I felt, so you stress that nobody has worked on the language of thought, the evolution of the language of thought hypothesis. And so my worry is that, everything that you said, can be applied to all kinds of communication signals, right? So most of the things that you said are very abstract models, and that's very useful. Yeah. But the bad thing of using very abstract models is that they don't tell us any specific of the language of thought. So you mentioned a couple of things, memory and so on. But I miss what's specific of the language of thought. So what's the specific lesson for the language of thought?
Well, so I think this is exactly the approach we need to take, given our state of ignorance about the kind of basic architecture of the human mind and the details of it. So we don't know how basic symbols are realized or how basic computations are carried out. So I mean, it's totally premature to kind of go beyond this general level of description. And I think this is exactly the kind of level of abstraction that's useful at this stage. You know, as we gain a deeper understanding of how these kind of signs and computations on them, and how memory, for example, is physically instantiated in the brain. And again, there's lots of controversy here. Some people say this is all settled. I don't think it is. But then it becomes appropriate to start filling in empirical details. And I think, yeah, so this is the best that I could do. And I think the abstract nature of the model is actually a virtue in this case for that very reason, because going beyond the kind of abstract level is just kind of going to maybe cloud our judgment in the sense that it's going to commit us to certain physical details that might turn out to be just dead ends. So I think that this kind of abstract orientation of the question is perhaps the best sort of way to approach it at present.
So I had a question which is now more of a comment.
Okay.
One thing I wondered about is so the basic sender-receiver kind of game really depends on the question of mutual interest.
Yeah.
And so one kind of rough prediction you would make is that the more mutual interest there is, the more sophisticated the system should become. And that's part of the answer to this question.
Yeah.
It could be. So first of all, the question is whether you think that prediction really follows from this framework and whether it's true. And second, I mean, to what extent can it really distinguish between the case of a language of thought, which is presumably very sophisticated, because presumably it's evolved within a system in which there's a lot of mutual interest between senders and receivers.
Yeah, so I do think, so I would say it certainly contributes to the probability that the fancy sign system like that will evolve. You also need some kind of adaptive benefit. So it might be the case that you have lots of mutual interest, but there's not a whole lot that the organisms that are involved or the biological individuals that are involved need to do in order to thrive. And then it might, there might be no kind of real reason for the sign system to reach a very kind of complex state. So there needs to be some kind of ecological sort of advantage to talking about various things in order for there to be a kind of drive in the direction of more complexity in the sign system. I would think, joint or mutual interest alone needn't sort of result in a very sophisticated sign system. That sign system has to pay off.
I thought the point was they co-evolve, right? The mutual interest partly depends on the ability to derive benefit from communication.
Yeah.
But
suppose that the receiver is only capable of, say, performing 2 acts. How complex can the sign system get? And you can imagine some really simple cases where, there's just not the kind of resources internal to the system to kind of scale it up to a super sophisticated system. So when you have multicellular organisms moving around their environment, competing with other species and things in their niche, you have a recipe there that's perhaps absent when you're dealing with things at a much kind of lower level in the biological hierarchy. Maybe not. I mean, it's an empirical question, but all I would add is, I wouldn't say pure common interest alone will always give you this kind of fancy sign system. It's just that it's maximally conducive to it. And then you have to look at, does it pay for the sender and receiver to be kind of discriminating a very large range of states for them to be kind of computing relations among those world states and exploiting them in behavior? Those are all kind of questions that I would have to just sort of look at on a case-by-case basis, if that makes sense.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll say. Waltiero is next on my list.
Thanks. It's a lovely story, and I think that the way to capture what Mark was, one of the things that Mark was already worrying about is that, as far as I can tell, it has little to do with the language of thought per se. It applies to any compositional, combinatorial encoding sign system, including any standard neurocomputational representational system. So I like it. I just don't think it supports the language of thought over alternative ways of thinking about representation, mental representation. So.
I see it as a virtue of the account. So, I mean, the fact that it sort of takes, it removes language of thought from this kind of, very sort of special sphere and sort of grounds it in kind of biology more generally. Like, I think bees are running a language of thought. Ants are running a language of thought. So, I mean, I don't think that it's only humans. So, I mean, it had better be the case that kind of animals with complex, nervous systems are at least capable of this sort of thing, of evolving it possibly. So I don't want to limit it to a very special case of humans or even, primates or something like that. And I think that there are good reasons why, when you have two organisms where maybe there's imperfect common interests or something of this sort, that you don't get all of these gears turning in the right ways together that can thwart the kind of emergence of a sign system like this. This is kind of made special by the fact that it's within the organism, and it's an organism that has to do lots of sophisticated things to thrive. And I'm sort of arguing that memory is perhaps special, and that when you have systems that have to have memory, or that have memory, or that there's some adaptive advantage to it, that might sort of push us in the direction of this kind of special science system. And then maybe that creates a selection pressure for other parts of the brain to be doing something that's at least sort of compatible or commensurable with the language of thought that's being run in memory. So I mean, I raised those questions earlier. I think maybe once we have organisms that have sophisticated episodic memory, you get like kind of emergence of something like this, and then that can sort of be the impetus for other fancy science systems in the brain. But I mean, to answer your question, I don't think it's a kind of liability of the account that it makes the language of thought something that could evolve in all sorts of within the organism cases. I mean, so is that
That's not exactly what I was saying. I was saying that it doesn't discriminate between the language of thought hypothesis and the kind of mainstream neurocomputational story about cognition that is popular in cognitive neuroscience nowadays.
Okay, so maybe we have different so I certainly don't want to be held hostage to everything Jerry Fodor has said about this. That's why at the beginning I just started out by saying it's an internal sign system with a compositional syntax and semantics and procedures that operate on it that are sensitive solely to the formal properties of signs. That's all I mean by it. So if mainstream cognitive neuroscience is positing something like this, then that's great. I mean, I'm helping them out as far as I can tell then.
This relates closely to things I've written, and I'll send you links, but there are also some interesting differences which I'll mention. One difference from Fodor is that he thinks that everything any human ever says or thinks can be translated into the innate language of thought, which I think is completely implausible. We agree on that. But I've argued that perceptual abilities of intelligent organisms require compositional, semantic, structural variability, variations in structural complexity of percepts, likewise intentions, states to be achieved, likewise plans for achieving intentions, likewise questions, and therefore there are all sorts of reasons why something with those features that you're talking about should have evolved not only in humans, but all sorts of intelligent organisms like elephants and nest-building birds and squirrels and so on, and our ancestors, of course. But I also suggested in this stuff that when cooperation starts happening, it may initially happen through coordinated actions. And to cut a long story short, that could lead to the evolution of sign languages for communication before spoken languages. And there is evidence that every normal human is born with the ability to learn a sophisticated sign language. We just don't now, for most of us, unless we are in a deaf community, in which case we do. The other thing it implies, or is relevant to, is that the general notion that languages are learnt by humans is false. Languages are cooperatively created by humans, but in general, the children who are cooperating are in a minority, but there are exceptions, like the spectacular case of deaf children in Nicaragua, if you know that case.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So I mean, I work on the evolution of language too, and so I agree with everything you said there. One of the interesting kind of questions I have is, how these two kinds of systems might be interacting in language using creatures. So again, I would apply this to the emergence of public languages, but there it needn't be this kind of blind evolutionary process. You have intelligent behavior, partially in virtue of what's going on here, but you can also get stuff being put in the sign system initially without any rhyme or reason, and then being co-opted to play various roles because receivers are picking up on it. So I think that this kind of general story, well, I haven't given you a general story. I've given you a kind of few concepts and processes, but I think it is general in the sense that it might also apply in the case of the creation of public languages by, intelligent beings together. That some of the same stuff applies, but now we have to factor in kind of intentional selection and not just kind of reinforcement and kind of, like biological selection. So, but I agree with everything you said.
Just one small last point. I think the fact that these internal, previously evolved languages are required for perceptual and action semantics imposes additional constraints that you don't get if you're just considering arbitrary sequences of signs in the way that you have. Now, what those constraints are is an empirical question, and it may be that that is something that will change your story eventually.
Thank you.
We're not done yet. Rosa, please.
Clarification, and follow up on what Walter had said. So the clarification, I was wondering if you think the encoding principle has to be stored explicit, has to be an explicit thing.
Yeah. So I worried about that a lot, and I wanted to. So let me put it to you this way. The first thing I was thinking was, let's say that the rule is sort of the sender rule itself sort of takes this form. And then you say, well, okay, exactly what does that mean? Is it explicitly represented? No, I don't always want it to have to be that, so it's implicitly represented. Okay, well, what is my account of implicit representation? Well, there's no kind of very good account of implicit representation. So the way that I have things set up at the moment is to kind of hope that I can get by without having to come down on that question and say, look, the existence of this pattern will select for certain kind of mechanisms in the receiver, whatever they are, and that's going to feed back to kind of change or shape the mechanisms in the sender, whatever they are. And so there's going to be the kind of evolution or coevolution of a set of mechanisms in the two or more agents or individuals where the fact that this regularity obtains is an important part of explaining that evolutionary trajectory. So it's not like completely explanatorily idle, but to sort of work out, in what sense a mechanism implements this specific principle as opposed to some other, it's hard. So I was hoping I could sort of remain non-committal about that at the moment, but I have worried about that a bunch.
Okay, so now I want to ask my actual question. So you have this encoding principle, it might be implicit, it might be explicit, and then you have this combinatorial, like what it takes for the code to be combinatorial. And that sounded like a pretty weak condition, overlapping use of parts.
Yeah.
Right, so if I have like connectionist style representations and like the same unit is active in two different ones, and that counts as a combinatorial code.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have both those two. Suppose you go the implicit route on the encoding thing. This is where it's a follow-up to what Gualtiero was saying. In the second part of your talk, it sounded like you were pushing a very Gallistel-like line where you say, the way that neuroscientists think that memory works can't possibly be right because it doesn't have these combinatorial encoding, beautiful, elegant computational features that digital computing systems have. But it seems like for all that you've said, for these very weak notions of combinatoriality and encoding principles, the actual nervous system working in the way that we understand it to work with neural plasticity and changes in synaptic weights, is a perfectly adequate language of thought type system.
Okay, great, yeah. So let me distinguish myself from Randy in at least this respect. I think I'm actually more sort of sympathetic to that view than you might expect.
Which view?
The view that Rosa was just presenting there. So if it turns out that, suppose that's right, and you tell me the kind of standard neuroscience question or a story, and you say, and look, this is an alternative to the language of thought hypothesis, but then we're kind of thinking through what it is for a system to instantiate such a architecture, and it turns out that, actually that architecture does meet standards that are sort of have a legitimate claim to being described as a combinatorial science system with a compositional semantics and with procedures defined over them, then the thing to say is people like Randy are sort of wrong about the physical commitments of a kind of language of thought type of architecture. And, of course, sort of distilling down the physical commitments of that kind of architecture isn't a kind of trivial task, it's a philosophical task. And so I would say, I'm more comfortable with the kind of computer science, logical principles and what they imply about the kind of architecture. I'm on board with him there. I'm less confident about the move from that stuff to the physical instantiation and how that has to be. That's where he takes a strong stand, and I might want to have a more nuanced view there, if that's at all satisfactory to you.
Yeah, but I think distinguishing yourself might be a reason to run on the
The
encoding.
last couple
Okay.
minutes of Mark.
Thanks very much indeed for pressing the question on the evolution of the language of thought. I just wanted to ask how you see the proposal relating to the work of Simon Kirby's lab on the evolution of language.
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. I'm, only vaguely familiar with that work, but so I think you can have the emergence of these kind of distinctively language-like features in the absence of cultural evolutionary processes. So like learning and things of this sort. And as far as I understand, Kirby and his colleagues sort of make that central to the emergence of things like combinatorial signs and compositional meaning. So here's a kind of way that, cultural evolution would be a specific case of the kind of thing I'm imagining here. And I'd actually be more than happy to go along with it when it comes to the evolution of external public sign systems. So I don't think that there's some tight connection between the presence of a language of thought and a public language. Because, as I said, I think ants and bees and things of this sort have a language of thought. They don't have a public language. So I don't think there's a tight connection there. So I think I'd be happy to take on board some of the specific details as regards, of Kirby and colleagues, as regards kind of the creation of public languages among humans. But I would say that's just one way you can get the emergence of these sorts of sign systems. And there's probably a kind of more general level at which all of these things can sort of be subsumed as, specific instances of the same general pattern here. But I do see there as being a kind of important connection. Yeah, but I have to think more about that. Thank you, though.
So thank you. It's been a
Thank you.